Today we're beginning a new series, and it's a series that I believe is really critical in this cultural moment for us, not just in the world, but also for us as the church. And by the way, that's a really heavy way to start a new series, right? This is really important in this cultural moment. By the way, that is not just my attempt to say, like, this matters, come back next week, because it's actually true. It is kind of heavy. It is really important, but it's actually true. And let me just explain it this way. Let me just back up for a second and say this. There's a psychological designation that was used infrequently at one time. When it was first developed, it was a term that was used sort of sparingly that now seems to define an entire era of human history. And it's a term that has actually been popularized today. We actually know this. It's a term, identity crisis. How many of you have heard the term identity crisis? Raise your hand. Not if you're having one, but if you know the term. Yeah. You probably are having one and know the term, right? If you know it, you're having it. But the term identity crisis, what is an identity crisis? Well, there was a psychologist named Erik Erikson who popularized that for the most part, and it really emerged originally out of adolescent psychology. That's where this term came about. Later on, we began to realize that it also applied to balding middle-aged men who bought convertible sports cars. That's like a thing called an identity crisis, right? But what those early psychologists were identifying was that some individuals seem to encounter obstacles in the formation of their identity. They have a problem in the development of a strong sense of identity. And so this unresolved crisis of sorts leaves them in a place where they find themselves at some point in life struggling to find themselves. So when you find somebody who's having an identity crisis, when you meet somebody who might fit this designation, they're struggling to understand who they are. They're trying to understand, like, what is my purpose here? Why am I here? What am I doing? Where should I be going? They start to wrestle with these deep existential questions about their life. And here's what's interesting, is that anyone who looks at our culture through a wide-angle lens today can see that this is no longer a term or a descriptor of a select few, but this has actually become a defining characteristic of a generation of people living in the world today. How do we know this? Well, it's not just because more balding middle-aged men are buying convertibles. It's because we can see this explosion of the topic in popular culture. So if you go to the bookstore and you look for books on identity, you will see that there are more and more books being written on this subject. If you go to the internet, you'll see more articles being written. You'll see more blogs being posted. In fact, just a couple of years ago, I think a year and a half, 2 years ago, the New York Times printed an article and it was entitled, "The Year We Obsessed About Identity." We obsess about identity in this culture. In the last 10 years, there is this boom of us thinking, like, who are we? Trying to answer the question, where do we come from? In fact, you've noticed that there's been this massive global phenomenon of people doing DNA testing, right? Ancestry.com, 23andMe, there's all these services because we want to know, where do I come from? Like, where's my heritage? There's something inside of us that's stirring around these issues. By the way, somebody gave me one of those, and I discovered that I was 60% Irish. I'm not sure I wanted to know that, right? It's like, great, it explains all the fighting. No, just kidding. Just kidding. But what's really going on with this? Why are we doing these things? Why the articles? Why the testing? Why is there this search? And the answer, when you start to take a step back and you look at culture as a whole, is that we seem to be having a massive identity crisis in our age. We don't know who we are. We sort of bounce from thing to thing, but we don't have a deep sense of who we are. Now, before you panic and start to think this is a global epidemic, let me assure you, this is not a new problem. We aren't the first human beings to walk the planet that have struggled with a deep sense of identity. The proportions might be greater today, but this has been going on for quite a while. In fact, has anybody heard of a guy named Socrates? Raise your hand if you've heard of him. Yeah, so Socrates, back when he was forming Western thinking, Western philosophy, when he was just in the early stages of this, there was a phrase that was common during his age. He made it popular, and it was the phrase that some of you know. It is, know thyself, right? Know thyself. Socrates said you need to know thyself, like that wisdom begins by you understanding you, that before you try to solve the world's problems, before you engage in critical thinking, before you deal with complex issues, it's really important that you as an individual know who you are. Do you understand who you are, how you work, how you're wired? It's an important thing. Some of you may have heard of Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu, a couple hundred years before Socrates, so even further back, he said this: knowing others is intelligence. Knowing yourself is true wisdom. Mastering others is strength. Mastering yourself is true power. Not bad advice, right? Some of us can probably take some of that advice, right? And the point of this and why I'm sharing this is that for a very long time, people have known, for a very long time in human history, we've known that knowing ourselves, that solving the crisis of identity, having a deep sense of knowing who we are, knowing our identity is an important part of being a human being. So here's something fascinating. Last week, I know I'm going to do this series on Know Thyself, and so I thought, well, I'm going to Google those two words, and just, it's always fun to see what comes up, and so I put in those two words, hit search, and there's immediate results. First one, it's Socrates, he pops up. Second one, Wikipedia, all of our favorite source of somewhat true information. And then third was this article that grabbed my attention. So the third result was this article, and it was from Psychology Today, and this was the title of it. It said, "Know thyself is not just silly advice, it's actively dangerous." Well, you had me at actively dangerous, right? I was like, well, I'm in then if it's actively dangerous. And so I'm reading along, and I come to this one particular paragraph, and it just sort of jumps off the page at me. Like, here I am, I'm thinking about the identity crisis, that all this weird stuff that's happening in our world today, all these things that are going on, this sort of global phenomenon, and this is what our cultural wise men are saying. This is what's being promoted in our culture. Third result in Google, I come to this paragraph, and it says, "Knowing thyself is an obstacle to acknowledging and making peace with constantly changing values. If you know thyself to be such and such a kind of person, this limits your freedom considerably. You might have been the one who chose to be an espresso person or a donating to charity person, but once these features are built into your self-image, you have very little say in what direction your life is going. Any change would be either censored or lead to cognitive dissonance." Did you catch this? If you know yourself, you will make decisions about who you are that will strip you of your freedom. Does this sound interesting to you? I mean, this is Psychology Today. So in a culture where expressive individualism is the driving force, freedom is our ultimate value, right? I want to be free at all costs. I don't restrict my freedom. And what this modern psychologist is saying is that it's dangerous to know yourself because you'll limit your freedom. So it's better to not know yourself and do whatever you want without consequences. And the question is this is a very real question. Does this work? Does it work? In fact, do any of these things work? Do the teachings of Socrates actually solve the crisis of identity? Does knowing yourself solve this? Do the teachings of Taoism, does that solve the crisis of identity? Does this answer this question? Does knowing yourself or not knowing yourself, how do we resolve this? The real question is, does any of it work? And so I want to take some time today because there is a seeming crisis with our identity. I want to take some time and I want to talk about identity. And then I'm going to talk at the very end about where we're going with this series. But I just want to back up first of all, and I want us to start with the most basic of questions so that we all understand what we're talking about. What is identity? When we talk about identity and this crisis that exists, well, what are we really describing? What are we unpacking in this single word? Well, there's two things that it represents, and let me just share them and then I'll talk about each of these things. Two things. First of all, identity is a deep and durable sense of who you are. I'll explain that in a minute. Secondly, it's a meaningful means through which you find value. You put those two things together, and that's what defines identity. A deep and durable sense of who you are. Now, let me just explain what I mean when I say this. Every one of us in the room, no matter who you are, we all wear different hats at some different point in our lives, right? We all put on, maybe in a particular day, you put on a different hat, you have a different persona that you have to kind of put on depending on the role that you're in, you have a different title, you have different responsibilities. And every one of us every day, we have to move through all of these different personalities, right? We have to move through all of these titles and responsibilities, one hat, another hat, sometimes two hats, right? We're doing all this stuff. When we talk about a durable core, what we're saying is that we have a sense of knowing who we are that isn't predicated by any one thing we are doing at any one time. In other words, we know who we are whether I'm wearing this hat or whether I'm wearing this hat or whether I'm wearing this hat. There is this core. I have a sense of who I am, and it really is existing outside the realm of whatever labels I might be putting on myself at any given moment. Tracking with me so far? So that's identity. We understand the second part of identity is a meaningful sense of where we get value. So why do you know you're valuable? How do you know you're valuable? Are you confident of your value? How do you feel significant in your life? When you have a deep sense of significance, then we would say you have a deep sense of identity. So understanding the core of who you are, regardless of what you're doing, and having a sense of significance, if you have those things in strength, then we would say you have a strong sense of identity. Now, here's the interesting part. Every culture has a way of doing identity formation. So every culture has a process through which we shape those two things, the way we shape our identity. Every culture tells its members how to get the sense of self and how to get that sense of value. The problem is there's no instruction manual. Like nobody gets born like, here you go, here's the ways you follow. There's no PowerPoint presentation. People still use PowerPoint, I think, but there's no presentation with bullet points that says, here's identity formation. The way we do it is through stories. So we hear stories, we hear songs, there are slogans, there are sayings that begin to prevail over us as a society, and those things begin to shape our identity formation. And every time this happens, it's just sort of presented as self-evident, like this is just the way that it is. Like, this is just how it happens. This is just who you are. This is just, which means this. It means that it's actually invisible to most of us as a result of this. We don't see the identity formation happening around us. It's like fish in water. Fish don't ever stop and evaluate the water. They just breathe it, right? They live in it. They breathe it. The identity formation that's existent in our culture is something that we don't identify. It just sort of is. It's self-evident. It just is happening to us. So, the crisis for all of us, including Ben Stenay, who says you shouldn't know yourself, is this. An identity is being shaped in you whether you are aware of it or not. Identity is being shaped whether you know it or not. You cannot stop that from happening. And so the question is, do you know who you are at your core? Do you have a deep enough sense of who you are that it transcends all of those moments that you find yourself in? Do you have a place in which you find value and meaning? Which, by the way, this is a crisis as much for Christians as anybody else. Let me just point this out. This is one of the reasons we're doing this series, is that you can profess Christ and still have your identity shaped by the cultural norms. In fact, that happens a lot. Because culture is invisible, because we can't see this, then we can actually profess Christ and be shaped by the pattern of our culture rather than the pattern that's set by Him. And so as a result of that, what I want to do is look at a new way to understand identity formation, a new way to understand our identity. And I want us to do it by looking at a fascinatingly human story that I think most of us can identify with. It's found in Genesis chapter 32. So if you have a Bible, kind of flip open there. And if not, we'll get to the words in a second. They'll be on the screen. But Genesis chapter 32, I want to give you a little bit of background before we dive into this, because we're going to jump into the middle of a story about a man whose name is Jacob. And Jacob has this interesting personal history before the moment we're going to pick up in. I want to make sure you get it. That there's a significant moment where when we really see him arise as a character is in a moment when he's deceiving his father. Jacob is one of two twins, Jacob and Esau. Jacob is born second, a few minutes after his brother. And the problem with that is this, that in that particular culture, at that particular time, in the Near East, a father would give a blessing, not only just a monetary blessing, but a general blessing to the oldest of his sons. And so Jacob is born second. He's not going to receive this blessing, but he wants the blessing. And he wants it so greatly that he decides to deceive his father, who is blind. And so he puts on some animal skins because apparently his brother was really hairy. And he goes to his father and he pretends to be his brother. The problem is while he's there, and we see this kind of question emerge in his life, while he's there, his father begins to sense that something's up. And so while he's sitting with his dad, deceiving him, his father asks this question that I think becomes the prevailing question of Jacob's life. His father says to his own son, "Who are you?" And I truly believe it's a foreshadowing moment for the rest of his life. Who are you? And Jacob says, "I'm Esau." And he lies. And so one of the most significant moments that we see in his life, the formative moment, we see Jacob pretending to be somebody that he's not. He deceives his father. He betrays his brother. His brother's outraged and decides he's going to kill him. So that brothers do this sort of thing. So Jacob, as a result, decides that he is going to flee to another country, flee to another land. He's going to start a new life. And so he does this. He runs to this foreign place and essentially starts a life that nobody knows about, right? Basically just starts over. Says, I don't want anybody to know who I was. I just got this kind of new identity. I'm going to pretend to be somebody that I'm not. Interestingly enough, few years into that, he gets really frustrated with his father-in-law for guess what reason? He betrayed him and deceived him, which is like, apparently he wanted to be the only deceiver in the group. So he decides, you know what, I'm done here. I want to go back to my homeland. The problem is, in order to do that, he's going to have to deal with his brother. He's going to have to deal with that past deception. He's been living this other life, and now he's going to go back. And so he begins his journey back. And as he's beginning there, he gets to this particular spot. He decides to camp. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to send messengers with a note to my brother. It's basically, are you mad, bro? That's basically the extent of it. Like, are you still mad? Can you forgive me? That kind of thing. So he sends his messengers. He's kind of hanging out, like waiting for them to come back, and they do. And they said, hey, guess what? We met with your brother, we gave him the note. He's coming to visit you. He'll be here in the morning, and he's bringing 400 men with him. I don't know how to take that, right? And so he's afraid, and he's desperate. You can almost see the crisis, right? He's left his family. Now he's left his other family. He's left, he finds himself as this person who's having a very genuine identity crisis. He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know where he belongs. And in this desperation, there's this really amazing moment. In fact, maybe you've heard of Jacob wrestling the angel. That's the story we're going to read right now, that Jacob wrestles with the Lord. In verse 24 of Genesis 32, it says this. It says, and Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. And then he said, let me go, for the day is broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go until you bless me. Notice that there's this passion of being like blessed. Give me what I want, right? And then he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Now, what has Jacob been doing? Well, he's been hiding, right? He's been living this life, trying to pretend he's someone else. Foreign people, foreign land. And now he comes back and he wants peace. He just doesn't want his brother to kill him, which is a very simple thing to ask, right? But he's been hiding. You need to understand this. He's been hiding. And what's the question that he gets asked in this moment? What is your name? Now, in the ancient Near East, your name was more than just words. It wasn't like our culture. My mom named me after a soap opera star in the 70s, okay? In the ancient Near East, your name was your identity. Your name is reflective of your character. It's your substance. It's the very fiber that made you. When your name was given, it told a story about who you are. So when this man asked Jacob, what's your name? He's actually asking him, who are you? Who are you really? And you can imagine Jacob in this moment, like he's being asked this name. He's in the middle of this tension, the foreign land, his old land. And now in this moment, who are you? And he's thinking, do I tell him who people think I am? Do I tell him who I pretend to be? Do you want to know what my wife and my kids think I am? Like when you ask, who am I? When you ask my name, what are you really asking? By the way, Jacob, the name literally means grabs at the heel or supplanter or trickster. That's what his name means. Imagine your parents giving you that. I got named after a soap opera star. He got trickster as a name, right? But he cheated his brother and he tricked his father. And he has this stuff in his life that he's been avoiding for decades, right? He's been hiding. He's been running. And now on the eve before meeting his brother, he's wrestling with the Lord. And the question is, who are you? Do you even know who you are? Do you have a sense of identity? And you see the crisis, don't you? You see the problem. At this point in Jacob's story, he's not sure who he is. He doesn't have a durable sense of his identity. He doesn't have a meaningful way through which he finds value. Clearly, this is a guy that's very desperate at every turn. And then there's this moment on the banks of this river, as the sun is dawning and the dew is in the air, when everything changes. And by the way, what happens next is what happens in our story that is so powerful. So verse 27 again says, he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And verse 28, everything changes. Then he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, trickster, liar, deceiver, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. So he says, what's your name? And Jacob says, I'm Jacob. He'd struggled and been broken. He's no longer pretending. He's wrestled and he's overcome. And then we read these words, from now on, you will no longer be known as Jacob, but Israel. No longer will you be known this way. And do you see the significance of what's happening here? This isn't just a name change. He's being given a new identity. All from answering this question, what is your name? Who are you? Who are you? As I put this question to myself, I think how much of our confusion or how much of our frustration, how much of our regret or our pain comes from us not being able to adequately answer this question ourselves? Who am I? Man, I don't know that I've answered that well. And so maybe you haven't answered it well. And so you have consequences in your life because you didn't understand your own identity, right? What's at the core of who you are? Do you find value in a meaningful way? There's a story of a first century rabbi named Rabbi Akiva. And this story has sort of lived on through the centuries. But it's a story of one night when he was traveling home. He came to a fork in the road, and to the right goes to his house, and to the left goes to a Roman barricade or a Roman outpost. And during the first century, if you were a Jewish rabbi, that's not where you want to go. So he's traveling home one evening. There's actually two versions of this story that get told. One is that he was reading the Torah, and he was so enthralled with the law of God that he didn't notice that he took the left turn. The other story that gets told in Jewish history is that he had been with friends and he drank too much wine, and so it was too dark and he missed the turn. So in either case, it doesn't really matter because in both stories, he takes the left and he doesn't take the right. And so after a little bit of walking, he winds up at this Roman barricade, and he gets there and he's suddenly startled, and there's this Roman soldier there who says and yells at the rabbi. He says, what are you doing? Who are you and what are you doing here? And the rabbi's kind of startled in this moment. He kind of listens and thinks for a moment, and he doesn't respond. And so this sort of legendary story arises around this rabbi. He kind of stands there for a moment, and the soldier says, who are you and what are you doing? And the rabbi finally responds and he says, how much do you get paid? And the guy says, 100 denarii. Why? And he said, I'll double that if you come to my house and every day you ask me that question. Who am I? And what am I doing here? Who are you and what are you doing here? You see, the struggle of Jacob is the struggle of all of us. Who are you and what are you doing here? What is your identity? You know how you meet people and they ask you what you do for a living? And you know how there's this little party that never wants to answer, at least for me? It's like, you talk about killing, like a buzzkill on a relationship, right? What do you do? I'm a pastor. See ya. Like that just happens so fast, right? But I'm not the only one. Like I've got friends that are accountants and you're like, people, what do you do for a living? Well, I work with numbers. Well, because you have an idea of what somebody does that does this job, right? We all know somebody who does the job that I do, and you don't want them to think that you're like that person, right? And so when someone ever asks you, what do you do? You're always like, well, let me explain. They're like, so you're an accountant? Oh, so you're a pastor? Well, yeah, I guess so, right? But then there's this other thing. There's this deeper sense that when somebody is getting to know you and they're asking those sorts of questions, isn't there a sense that we understand that what you're trying to do is get to know who I am? What you're trying to understand is, who am I? You're trying to get to know me. And we have this deep sense that I am not what I do. I am not defined by this. And so I know that somebody's asking what I do, but there's this thing inside of me that wants to go beyond that, because beyond that is where you actually discover my true identity. The problem is that our culture hasn't given much else for us to answer the question of identity with, right? I mean, think for a moment. What has culture given us to answer the question of where we find the core, this durable core of who we are? What has culture told us about where we find value and meaning? What are the options it's given us? There's lots of answers, right? Here's what's interesting about it. If you take all of the options of our cultural formation of identity and you put them together, they all boil down to one thing. They all come back to personal achievement. It all comes back to personal achievement. Sure, there might be variations of this, but that's basically it. Our culture's methodology for finding identity is based upon what you do, right? It's on what you do. You earn the respect of your peers. Notice the word earn. You work for the regard of your boss. You work, right? You labor to make yourself happy, right? You work to make yourself happy. You strive for the approval of your friends, of your family. You try to win the love of another person, right? It is all based on our personal effort, our personal achievement. But the question is this: what happens when our effort is not enough to answer the questions? What happens when you check all the boxes and you go to the best school and you get the best job and you marry the most beautiful partner and you get the best kids and it's still not enough? What do you do then? What happens then? See, the problem with achievement is that it's always built on our effort. And what if we give everything we have and it's not enough? Or what if things we've worked for reject us, abandon us, leave us? What if the job goes away? The people go away? What if we can't win their approval? What happens when we mess things up? What happens when we take a line of direction and we get down that road and we give everything of ourselves to it and then it betrays us? What happens to our identity then? See, the problem with our culture's achievement-based identity formation is that all it takes is one shift in one of those categories, and the core of who we are, that sense of who we are that goes with us no matter what we're doing, suddenly becomes shaky. Like our identity falters when any one of these things starts to be messed with. By the way, that's Jacob's story. That's his story until we come to Genesis 32. It is all about achievement, right? Whether it's the approval of others, whether it's the gaining of some sort of blessing that he's demanding, all of his identity is wrapped up in what he could do, even if what he did was wrong. And then what happens? He gets a new name. He gets a new identity. But notice how he gets it. Notice the difference. How does he get it? He doesn't achieve it. God gives it to him. God gives it to him. God renames him. There's this metaphor that Jesus uses to talk about people who follow him. It's actually not very complimentary. Jesus refers to himself as the shepherd, and he refers to his followers as what? If you've ever been around sheep, you know that's not a compliment, right? They are not the brightest, most brilliant of creatures in the world. But here's what's interesting about sheep, and what's interesting about the language of Jesus. Jesus says, I know my sheep, and my sheep know my voice. He even says in another spot in John 10, he says, my sheep, I name them. I know their names, and they respond when I call them. So Jesus gives his sheep names. Sheep are smart enough to know their master's voice and to know that they have a name. And so Jesus names his sheep. But what's he really saying here? What does it mean that he gives them names? Maybe it's like that moment when he's with Peter, who would eventually be the apostle Peter. Well, maybe that's the moment when he's with Peter and he says, you know what, from this point forward, you're no longer Peter. From this point forward, you are Cephas. And the word Cephas, by the way, translates the rock. He was the OG, the rock, just so you know. He says, from this point forward, you're no longer Peter. I'm calling you Cephas. Like I've got a new name for you. Why? Because I have a new identity for you. I want you to think about yourself differently moving forward. Maybe that's what Jesus is doing. Maybe when Jesus gives us a name, when he gives us a title, maybe when he gives us a new designation when we begin to follow him, he's not just saying, hey, this is kind of fun and fancy. He's literally saying, I'm giving you a new identity. Maybe he's saying to all of the Jacobs in the world, you are no longer known as Jacob. You are from this point forward known as Israel. You have a new identity. See, our culture... Our culture disregards this because it is the opposite of how we've been told to form identity. Our culture says, you've got to do it yourself. But just let me tell you this, and this is powerful. In Christ, you have the only identity on earth that is received instead of achieved. This is the only way you ever find a sense of identity, a deep, durable core of who you are, a deep sense of meaning and value that is received rather than achieved. In Jesus, you have the only identity that is received. And by the way, that makes all the difference in the world, doesn't it? It's not achievement that's getting you this. It's an announcement about who you are. It's being proclaimed over you. This is who you are. This is your identity. And by the way, he doesn't do this in some sort of abstract way. He does it by laying down his life for us. So that every time we look at that, every time we see the cross, every time we hear the story, we also hear our name. Jesus has something for you. He has a durable sense of identity. He has a meaningful sense of value that he's offering you. And that transcends the ups and downs of life and all the hats that you and I are putting on, all the confusion and all the disappointment. Jesus says, I've got something that can weather every single storm, and you will hold on to it, and you will be a different kind of person if you receive it. But I want you to notice something about Jacob. Notice what happened right before he received his new identity. When he's asked who he was, he admits it openly. The achieving, the hiding, it comes to an end. What is your name? Who are you? That's an important question for us. And who are we? I'll tell you who we are. We're people who have pasts, right? And we're people who have families that we come from that are maybe a little dysfunctional. And we're people who have done things that we don't want other people to find out. We're people who have mistakes that have been made that we try to just cover up. We have identities that are anything but durable. They're fragile. But if we will embrace our story, I'm not saying that we're proud of our story, but you do have to claim it. That's the starting point for receiving your new identity. And by the way, that's the story of the gospel, isn't it? We come to the cross and we say, you know what, I'm broken. By the way, I'm Brad, I'm broken. And Jesus says, you're loved. You're loved. And that honesty is met with his grace, and a new name is received. And no one, no circumstance, no person, no situation, no illness, no job loss can ever take from you the identity that Jesus gives you. Amen? What is your name? The New Testament contains a number of designations given to people who choose to follow Jesus. A lot of us in the room have made that choice. And a designation has been given to us. And I think there's something important that we understand that God does not give us names for no reason. I believe these names, that we receive them, and when we receive these names, they have life-altering, identity-shaping power for us. And so for the next several weeks, we're going to be taking time to look at these names, some of the more prominent ones that are given to people like us that reshape and reform our identity. We're going to receive these things. And we're going to look at what it means that God calls us a disciple. What does that mean to be a disciple? He calls us a follower of the way. What does that actually mean? What does it mean to be called sons and daughters and heirs? What does it mean to be called servants or slaves? What does it mean to be called believers? What does that even mean? Why does he call some of us believers? Why does he call us Christians? Where does that term come from? What does that say about our identity? For the next several weeks, we're going to be unpacking these words, these terms, these names, because they are the ones that have been given to us. We have not achieved them. God has proclaimed them over us. And I believe there is deep, rich truth available for us in this. Sound good? Would you stand with me? May you honestly and openly struggle with your identity. And may you discover a durable core and a meaningful sense of value. And may that be an identity that is received and not achieved. Amen? Amen. Amen. Love you guys so much. Thanks for being here today. We'll see you guys next Sunday. See you later.